So with that, I'm going to introduce Joanna Bird. She is the Executive Director of NASW Pennsylvania. Before taking on the role of Executive Director at NASW-PA, Joanna actually held a position of Director of Government Affairs at the Florida chapter of NASW-PA, or sorry, of NASW, that is. She's really well versed with the processes surrounding legislation and advocacy, so I know she's going to have a lot of really good information on that, and I hope you guys enjoy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Joanna.
All right, thank you, Tyler. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who's on the webinar today. This is an important topic and an interesting exploration, and we've got a lot of content, so I will go through it, but as Tyler mentioned, please type in your questions as we go, and we will have a couple of times throughout the presentation where we will stop for questions. So as we said, this is the topic of this presentation is ethics and advocacy. And first, when we get into that, so of course we're going to be focusing on the sections of the Code of Ethics that relate more to advocacy, in particularly focusing on section 6.04 of the Code of Ethics, which this slide is bullet points, sort of a summary of what that says, which is that we should, as social workers, we should engage in social and political action. We should be aware of the impact of legislation and policy on our practice. We should work to expand choice and opportunity for all populations. We should advocate for changes that will improve social conditions, and we should promote social justice. So that's a lot of stuff, but it's like, as we know, that is one of the parts of the Code of Ethics that, unlike some of the others, if you violate it, if you just don't get involved in social and political action, it's one that you probably for an ethics violation, or brought up on brought for mediation with NASW for an ethics violation. So so there are some pieces of the Code of Ethics that, while they're imperative, that they're enforced less than others. So we're going to look at this a little bit more, and we're going to talk about why social workers should continue to be involved, and some of the unique things that we bring to the table. Including, like we have here, my opinion on all of this is that that social workers offer some very unique skills and perspectives and opinions on social policy. And if we are not bringing those to the forefront, if we're not sharing those perspectives with our elected officials, those opinions won't get heard, because it's not, if other people are involved, other people may be doing advocacy, but other people aren't going to bring to the table what social workers can. So it's absolutely imperative that we do get involved, because, because we have a unique perspective to share. One of the most important things in that is that person and environment perspective that's so intrinsic to the social work philosophy and theories. And that really, how that relates to policy is because, we know that people interact with their environments, and that the problems that people have are connected to the communities and the things that are surrounding them. And one of the things that's surrounding them is policy. And so, as we go through trying to help our clients, eventually we're going to get to the point where the thing that will help our clients the most is to change the policy that may be negatively affecting them. But it also means, so that's part of why we should be involved, but it also means that we can share that perspective with our elected officials, that that if there's a significant problem going on, that we can bring in how the environment is actually impacting people. And legislators, most legislators, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, whether they agree with your perspective or whether they don't, most legislators are trying their best to to help people. They they are interested in helping people, but they just have different perspectives on how to accomplish that and what will be the best thing. From a perception of like what their worldview is, as opposed to what social workers may be able to bring to the table, which is the realities of what's happening in the field and how specific policies are having an impact on people's lives. But they're also very receptive to stories. They're receptive to hearing about what, about how what they're doing or how the lack of a policy is hurting somebody, or how creating a new policy will help somebody. And so that's another thing, is that we can bring a face to the issue. We may be able to empower our clients or other people who are being impacted to advocate for themselves and bring their own stories in front of the legislature, or we may be able to share some of those stories on behalf of our clients. And then finally, the people who are the most effective advocates are the people who have who have a relationship with their elected official, and nobody is better at building relationships than social workers. We do that from the very first social work class we take. We learn about things like establishing rapport, the interviewing skills, our active listening skills, reframing, and and use of self with our clients. All of those are skills that we use to be effective advocates, especially when we're meeting one-on-one with our elected officials. And that does point to a couple of other things, that while social workers are statistically more politically active than the general population, they're only about as active as other professional groups, like some of the other professions that you hear about. And so we're not any more active than other standard professionals. And at least 1/3 of social workers are not active at all. And considering that meeting that bar for at all just means, potentially writing a letter to your elected official every once in a while, then it's not a very high bar to pass. And we really do have some work to do as far as getting our social workers, to meet that standard of the Code of Ethics. There has been a little bit of research that's been done about how to overcome some of those obstacles and what are the barriers that stand in the way for a lot of social workers. Some of the ones that have been identified are feelings amongst social workers that they lack competency and advocacy. The things we do offer courses and other things to help even those out, and participating like in our legislative education and advocacy day gives a lot of people firsthand experience with that. But it still doesn't stop the fact that amongst social workers there is a feeling that like, oh well, I don't advocate because I don't feel skilled enough. I don't feel like I would be effective as an advocate. And that's something that I feel like is legitimately not true, because a lot of the skills that we use as social workers, the same skills that are effective with our clients, are the exact same skills that are effective with our legislators, like we were just talking about. So really, we just need to do a little bit more work on trying to get folks to recognize that and to apply the skills that they already have. Part of the way that is limited or has been structured is because of, especially at the MSW level, there's a split between education in micro practice and education in macro practice, and you usually either focus in one or the other. And so you have limited classes, especially if you did focus in clinical social work, you may have had limited education in that macro experience. Some people have issues with perceiving how legislative and regulatory issues are relevant to their practice, which again is another myth that we try to break on a regular basis, because that everything is connected to policy. I mean, when you get out of bed in the morning, you go in a shower that's the pipes in the ground are a particular depth because of policy. You drive and you get on the right side of the road and you stop at the stoplights and you obey the speed limits, all because of policy. You're obeying or choosing not to obey like 50 laws before you've even hit 10 a.m. So everything that we do, including especially how we practice social work, things like our scope of practice and our licensing regulations and everything like that is related to policy. And certainly the things that are impacting our clients are related to policy. And then finally, just that belief that politics is dirty or distasteful. Which, sometimes it can be, but again, it's not going to change unless somebody holds people accountable. And there's no reason why that couldn't be social workers, or at least that social work could be a part of that. So a couple of the ethical implications before we move on to a different segment. One is, of course, that Section 6.04 is not limited to folks. It doesn't say macro social workers should do this, but but it does apply to everybody. So that's a question that comes up in when we're discussing the code of ethics. So are we? If you're not advocating, or is it possible to fully address client needs? Advocacy as a possibility. I would say it always needs to be open for consideration, and I would also say that every social worker needs to at least have that basic knowledge and comfort, because really with this one, it's really one of those things that you're not going to be comfortable with until you start doing it, and you get more and more comfortable as you get practice. So we just kind of need to get started in that process, and that can be the biggest question. Like, so where do, if with opportunities all over the place to get involved, where do you start? And we can talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So the next segment is on politics. We'll talk about politics first, and then policy, and then we'll talk about some of the nature of the process and how that can impact what we do as well. But we'll first start with politics, and I'll share a quote. One of my favorite quotes relating to politics from Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is an MSW and a social worker. She's a senator out of Michigan, and her quote is, "It is easier to spend a few months and some money electing the right people than to spend years and a lot of money trying to get the wrong people to do the right things." So reason I love that quote is because it really does express exactly why politics is an issue when we talk about advocacy. Because we could say, well, we don't want to get involved in who runs, or, Republican versus Democrat, the whole side of that, or, some of those arguments. But really, when we get down to it, it's about making sure that the people who share our values, who are more likely to support the social work profession and the clients we serve, regardless of party line, that they are, that they have a higher chance of getting in office, and that then we can make further advances as a profession. So I have a few cartoons mixed in here. This is one of them, that 2/3 of eligible voters don't vote, and they and that whole group was like, oh, we didn't vote because we didn't feel like my one vote would make a difference. But we see that huge population would have easily overwhelmed the other side that did vote. So politics matters, like I said earlier, because if we get those values in, then we can have a greater impact to the social work profession. The way that the people who are in office feel, if they are respectful of the social work profession, or again, you can take this towards any client population that you may specialize in, if they're receptive to, hearing about elders, if they're receptive to dealing with mental health, if they're receptive to dealing with suicide prevention. All of those things make a really big difference. And the more that people who agree with us are in power, the more that they're able to have that strong impact on public policy. Though that has really long-term effects, because getting a bill passed is easier than getting it revoked, as the people who are against the Affordable Care Act have found. Once a policy is in place, it's a lot harder to get it taken away. And then another one, especially for if getting involved in, the United States, like your school boards, county, borough council, city commission, those are all just as important and can have sometimes even more of an effect on the clients that we serve. And so definitely don't ignore local elections. We'll talk about gerrymandering a little bit. This district that I'm showing is one that was recently changed with the Supreme Court decision, but that was one of the most famous examples of gerrymandering, and that was Pennsylvania's 7th district. Still in place right now, but moving forward for the next election will be shifted. Why is gerrymandering important? Over time, it leads to more extreme viewpoints, because if you've got a solid Republican or a solid Democrat district, then your primary challenge, as far as whether you're going to win re-election or not, isn't based on whether you can compromise with the other side. Instead, it's based on how strong a Republican or how strong a Democrat are you? You're more likely to face opposition from a primary challenger than you would from the general election. And so therefore, you're going to be penalized for compromising or working with the other side, or anything that would make you serve. So we've seen the effects of some of the gerrymandering that's been happening with more extreme viewpoints, and particularly in the United States Congress, gridlock, or things not being able to get done because nobody is willing to work together. And it is also a social justice issue, because gerrymandering is all about politicians choosing their. And I think part of social justice is that opinion that that we are able to elect people that represent our issues, and so that's one reason why gerrymandering is important. And here's another cartoon for kind of representing gerrymandering. Both parties are equally guilty of doing that, but in recent years, around the same time that computer modeling became so advanced that gerrymandering was more of a science and more exact than ever, was also around the time that the Republican Party made major advances in state legislatures, and the state legislatures were the ones who were able to the state legislators, whoever is in charge of the state government, is the people who get to define the districts right after the census. So right now it is very heavily imbalanced, where gerrymandering benefits the Republicans, but in the past and in other states it has benefited Democrats. It has strongly benefited Democrats as well. So the answer to gerrymandering is frequently considered a nonpartisan issue. So what can social workers do in the political realm? Well, basics, be registered to vote, making sure to vote in the primaries and the general elections, helping to register others to vote. That's not one on my list, but I think I'm going to make sure I add it for the next presentation. volunteer or donating for a candidate. And that doesn't necessarily mean, some folks, you don't like to make cold calls or ask people for money, or you don't necessarily want to stand out on a street corner. Candidates need a whole bunch of stuff. So, so they just contact them anyway and let them know what you do not want to do, and they can find something that matches to your skill set. The other piece about volunteering or donating to a candidate is that candidates do remember the people who knocked on doors for them, or who was out there beating the bushes for their campaign, and that gives you a little bit more of that personal relationship with your elected official that then you can use to be an effective advocate down the line. A few other things to do: volunteer or donate for a PAC. NASW does have a PAC. It's called PACE, which is Political Action for Candidate Election. And we are always accepting new members or feedback, etc. You can mobilize or educate others to get involved, to vote. You can, volunteer to take people to the polls. You can organize to change the elections process, like the gerrymandering that I was just talking about. There's a group called Fair Districts PA that's advocating on behalf of getting a nonpartisan commission to draw the election district lines, as opposed to the whoever is in charge of the legislature. And then finally, you can run for office. Social workers are natural candidates, natural politicians, and have a great understanding and a lot to offer. And we've seen an increase in that this year. In the last election, I think it was just recently in the 2017 election, we had a larger number of people running for school boards, borough council, county commission, etc. And we do have at least one social worker in our state senate. We have a social worker who's running for office in the state legislature, and we have I think at least 12 social workers in the United States Congress. So definitely something to consider if it's ever an area of interest. I mentioned our PAC earlier, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because this is a CE event and not a membership drive, but just to briefly say that PACE is the Political Action Committee of the NASW, and that we do things like helping to elect candidates who support policies consistent with the social work profession and the clients we serve. I'll promote political education and voting amongst social workers. So finally, in this section, we'll once again talk about, are there any specific ethical issues related to the political side? And I'm not going to provide answers to these, because part of the whole process of ethics is that it's the one necessarily that doesn't have an answer. It's things we need to consider, things we need to talk about and share. One is to say, is voting an ethical requirement for social workers? Should all social workers, regardless of who they vote for, at least vote? Does a candidate's views have to, particularly align with the code of ethics in order for you to say you'll vote for them? There are some, chapters of NASW that only align, that only will endorse candidates whose views fully align with the code of ethics. I would say, in general, that's a hard standard to meet, and if they're not social workers. I think what you have to look at is the greater good. But okay, but does a social workers have does the candidate's views have to align with the code of ethics in order to vote for them, in order to volunteer with them, in order to contribute to them? How about for them to be endorsed by the chapter? So that would be another ethical issue for consideration. And then the last question that I think we come up across all the time, because we are so politicized at the moment, One is, does being an ethical social worker mean that you necessarily belong to one political party? And we do have a variety of social workers who belong to both or neither political party. And I would say that those things are not related, but at the same time, you know, the code of ethics does guide us when we're looking at political issues, and that we have to make sure that, you know, any one particular issue does at least track with the code of ethics. One of those issues in particular might be the the area of, like, does a bill or a piece of legislation discriminate against any particular group? And so, you know, using that standard, and this is like in detail what section 6.04 letter D says, which is that social workers should act to prevent and eliminate domination of, exploitation of, and discrimination against any person, group, or class on the basis of, and this is a long list, race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status, or physical or mental ability. Okay, so that's about that's a little bit about the halfway mark in my slides and in the presentation itself. So we'll take a short break and have an opportunity to answer your questions.
Great, yeah, thanks. So we do have a couple questions here. I think one that's relevant to what you were just talking about, really with the party line and party issues. Somebody kind of inquired about the dynamic tension between social justice perspectives and, like, more conservative analyses of social and economics issues. So I don't know how you necessarily interpret that question. I kind of imagine, you know, where do we, you know, do social justice perspectives allow for conservative analyses?
Well, I've done, and this is less like scientific research and more anecdotal. But I have had long conversations with both. We do have a social justice committee, and so we're working towards a lot of things on social justice right now. And yet we also certainly understand that we have a membership that is, that splits between strong liberal to strong conservative and everything in between, and that all connects to social work. I think that it's challenging to to always look at these issues and to understand the other side, the other perspective. But both from my experience, both sides usually are able to articulate how they feel on one particular issue, like why they feel that is consistent with the code of ethics, or and I'm only talking about specific things. There's going to be some issues where the code of ethics is going to take a really clear side, but in general, when I speak with conservatives or when I speak with strong liberals, they're able to articulate why they feel the way they do and how they feel it's consistent with being a social worker. And that's one thing that I would caution us all about, because sometimes when you see posts on social media, like NASW nationally might post a position statement, and it generally leans one way or the other on positions, but then in the comments section you'll see the infighting of the folks who either feel like their position or perspective is being ignored, or conversely the folks who say, like, well, how can you even be a social worker if you feel that way? And I think it's really important for us to all listen to each other and try to come to a deeper understanding.
For sure.
Next question.
Yep. So yeah, this one's more specifically about pace, and but it's more about where to.
Tyler, you're breaking up. I can't hear you.
My apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So about PACE, does PACE give money to politicians the same way the NRA does?
Not to the same magnitude, but to politicians, and we do endorse politicians. The NRA has a lot more money to work with. So yeah, when you hear about things like special interest groups or political action committees, PACE is just as much of a political action committee as the NRA, but we do not have anywhere near the same level of resources. Where funding comes from for PACE is that when you join NASW, you're able to sign off on that optional checkoff, which is only $10, and so of that, $5 goes to the state chapter and $5 goes to national. We also do a few things, like if you've ever come to our state conference, you've seen the PACE pot, and we have a few other like local fundraisers. But that gives us a limited number of money to work with. We use that money to go sometimes to fundraisers so that we can get access to high-level candidates or high-level elected officials when we're in need of stuff in the legislative arena. And then we also use it to contribute to candidates, but we're far more likely to contribute like $100 or $300 as opposed to the NRA, which might be far more likely to donate like $1,000 or to one of the periphery organizations that supports your candidates and isn't accountable to the same limits. They might even give like $50,000 or millions of dollars to one candidate. So our political power from our PAC is found a lot more in our endorsements and our volunteers and our ability to mobilize people to make phone calls and and knock on doors and that sort of thing, and a little bit less so on the actual dollar amount.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely clarifies things. Very last quick question before we move on. And this is somebody that was saying she's thinking of having a voter registration forms stack in her counseling office. Do you think that fits?
Do I think that that's what?
Do you think that that's like an appropriate place to encourage clients to, register to vote?
Sure. Yeah, I think as long as it's handled, very nonpartisanly, encouraging your clients to register to vote and to vote, particularly using it as possibly an empowerment tool, because like just that act of going and making your voice heard at the polls can be an empowering experience. And so that does benefit clients. Let's get folks registered to vote. Probably don't talk about, who the candidates or who you're voting for or anything like that in that sort of arena. But getting them registered to vote and encouraging them to participate is an amazing idea.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll let you get going here in just a second then. We did have Letty actually wrote in, and she is the chairperson of our PACE committee. And she did mention that PACE does have standards and criteria to who they endorse. And they have, I guess, a questionnaire in place. And so just to encourage our members, that it's not a flip of a coin. There are criteria in place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're at least all the chapters handle it a little bit differently. So does national. Our process involves a fairly stringent questionnaire. We're actually in the process of distributing that questionnaire right now to look at people for the May election and then following that for November. But things like asking them how they feel about various social work positions, how they feel about state agencies, and getting a lot of information from the candidates. So yes, we have good data. Okay, is that about it for the questions?
Yeah, we can move on and maybe hit a few more later if you have time.
Oh, sure. Sure. Like, presuming that we don't, yeah, absolutely run out of time, then we will have one more opportunity for questions at the end. Okay, so the next segment is the how to get involved on the policy level. And this, we have this lovely little chart just to, explore the three branches and how each of those three branches goes all the way from the federal level to the local level, and that the social work advocate can get involved in whichever and wherever in those in all of these different branches of government, where we think it would be the most effective to make the change. Sometimes, sometimes the legislature is unwilling to consider a bill, but the court might be willing to rule on the same issue, or the executive branch might be willing to do something about it. Or maybe sometimes you can't change things at the state level, but local cities are willing to take up some of the same issues. So we have to be broad spectrum and hitting a lot of different areas. What can social workers do in this arena? One is just basically to stay informed, to follow the news, to follow what's going on, to see if there are bills that are being proposed that would impact your clients significantly, or the practice or your social work practice significantly, either positive, make sure that you're doing what you can with that information. Like, if there's like one quick story about a social worker that was able to make a difference, Tyler mentioned that I worked with the Florida chapter. So there was and this also connects to the one down below about writing bills and getting sponsors, like being on that top level tier. So there was a social worker in Florida who worked in a hospital, and who through that hospital work was able to identify that there was a need for a policy change. There was people who were at the hospital who didn't have anybody to fill in as their surrogate, as their proxy for when they're making healthcare decisions. In general, that the healthcare proxy can be like your spouse, your parent, your adult child, sibling, all the way down to like family, friend, or even neighbor, if you have somebody who's willing to stand up for you. But there would be some people who would get down to the bottom of that list and still wouldn't have anybody to work on their behalf. So the social worker noticed that and said, like, well, that would be that needs to change, because somebody needs to take up somebody needs to be there to advocate on behalf of the clients, and that's a natural role for social workers. So she brought to the local NASW chapter that observation and the suggestion that we write something that we then would work to get that policy changed. And to write in that social workers could be the catch-all at the bottom and make sure that every person had access to a healthcare proxy. Within like 2 or 3 years, we were able to get that bill passed. But again, that was like where one person in practice, because they were kind of had that ear towards like, well, what's happening in the legislative arena and how can policy impact my practice, that they were able to make a real change. So that's one reason to like always stay informed and make sure that that you are doing what's needed on behalf of your clients. But for the most part, being involved doesn't mean that you have to be writing bills yourself or coming up with the next great bill. It just means like being aware of what's out there. When you do hear about what's out there, whether it's good or bad, making sure that you're advocating through phone, emails, or letters, that you might be willing to testify in a public or a legislative hearing, that you might visit your legislators, because the most effective tool that you have at your disposal is that direct, like one-on-one legislative visit or group visit, that you might organize others to do the same, like as we'll talk about in a minute, like getting others to make phone calls can be highly effective. So yeah, this is that chart that another researcher did to say, like, to ask a bunch of staffers if their legislator hadn't made a decision on something, then how likely would any of these things be to make a difference? And 46% said that an in-person constituent visit, that visit with your elected official, would make a lot of difference. And another 51% said at least some. So that's 97% that said that was effective, and highly effective. Individualized, which means like personal, which means not a form letter. Letters and emails were second, and that was like with at least 20% said it would be highly effective, and 70% said at least some. Phone calls are next on the list. And then the reason why I include this one is because, you know, from stereotypes or thoughts or philosophies, many of you might have put that a visit from the lobbyist was going to be like way up here at the top because, you know, hey, they're the people who did it for a living, and they're the, you know, the quote unquote special interest groups. But no, a visit from a lobbyist, only 8% said it would be highly effective, and 74% said it would have at least some effectiveness. And the reason for that is because legislators care about hearing from their constituents. And if you've taken the time to go out and visit them, then that really shows a lot. The least effective one, but again, it's not totally ineffective. So if you only care a little bit, then, you know, you might as well, is those form letters and emails. So I always say, kind of judge it based on how much you care about something. If you only care about it a little, then go ahead and send that form letter. But if you care about it, at least kind of in the mid-range, then pick up the phone and make a phone call, and or write a letter or post something on social media, which it wasn't included in the last study because it was, at the time of the study, it was it's changed vastly since then, even in the last few years. Just as an example, Twitter, in 2009, 39% of Congress had Twitter accounts. 9 years later, in 2018, all 50 U.S. senators and all but 4 members of the United States House of Reps have Twitter accounts. And one of the things that they've been saying about Twitter is that that this is one thing, unlike the letters and the emails, those are read by staffers, and I mean, reaching staffers is a great thing, but Twitter, social media, Facebook, all of that, the legislators actually follow that themselves, and they're a lot more likely to answer that personally. I did put a little note here about the, you know, potential impact of bots and whether that will have any impact on that moving forward. You know, especially in some of the things that we're learning now about how easy it is to, you know, put false information or fake accounts on there. But right at the moment, it's still a great way to reach out to your elected official. So, especially if you're already one who's connected on social media. We'll go through a couple of other little tips here. One on the phone is all about volume. So can you generate 2 calls, 5 calls, 10 calls, etc.? Because they're basically just going to keep like a tally mark about how many, like, that they report to the senator or the or the rep or, you know, city council member or whoever. But they're going to say like, hey, we got 5 calls on this, and 4 were for it, and 1 was against. So if you can get other people to call, then do so, but keep the calls themselves short and simple. And it also means that you don't have to have a ton of, you do not have to be an expert on a bill in order to make a phone call on a bill, because all you have to say is something along the lines of, I'm a constituent of Senator Regan, and I support Senate Bill 530. So something as quick and easy as that. Mail and email, this one is a little bit more, again, like I said, don't use form letters if you can avoid it. It's one of the reasons why we tend to send out talking points as opposed to like potential scripts, because we're wanting to encourage you to at least use your own words. If you have examples of how you or your clients were impacted by a particular legislation or the lack of a particular piece of legislation, then use that. And then back up with the facts, but the personal stuff is somewhat more effective, and use that, but it does need to be backed up by facts. Cover only one issue per letter. So if you're upset about 10 things, or you want your legislator to know about 10 things, just write them 10 different letters and keep it one issue per letter, and as brief as possible. Like 1 page would be reasonable. The power of 10 thing. One of the rules of thumb that I've learned over time is that because most people do not contact their elected official, when somebody does, legislators and policymakers tend to weight it. They tend to say, well, okay, that one person who called probably represents 10 to 20 others who feel the exact same way, but who didn't pick up the phone. Well, knowing that can be very empowering, because you know that every time you call, that somebody is saying, that somebody on the other side of that is saying that you're representing 10 other people or 20 other people. And that means if you can convince one other person to make a phone call or 5 other people to make a phone call, then just think about how those numbers start to multiply. So as I mentioned earlier, constituent visits, absolutely the most effective tool that we have in our tool belts as far as making a difference to the elected officials. I can speak to many, many stories where somebody who voted against our bill in the prior year not only changed their mind, but became a co-sponsor the following year, basically because they had one social worker sitting in their office telling them why that bill was important to them. So it's tremendously, tremendously effective. Okay, so you can do that. That doesn't mean you have to come to Harrisburg or you have to come to DC, particularly when we're talking about state legislators, their district offices. So you can get an appointment with them, and instead of a 2-minute appointment, you'll end up with a 20-minute appointment or a 30-minute appointment. You can reach out to your elected officials during town hall or other public meetings where they'll be present. You can visit when you need something, but you can also visit when you don't need something, just to introduce yourself and to work on establishing a relationship, because building that relationship is key. For your meetings with your policymaker, the quick acronym of what you want to do to prepare is to remember your HAT. And I have both our Eastern Pennsylvania and our Western Pennsylvania hats represented. And the 3 things that you want to do is, 1, do your homework. Maybe learn a little bit about the legislator beforehand, learn about their interests, learn about their, where they went to high school, so that if you happen to go to high school at the same place, you can bring that up as an area of common interest. And maybe if you know something about their position on the issue, have your ask specific. Don't just be like, well, I support this issue. What do you want them to do? Do you want them to sign on as a co-sponsor? Do you want them to vote yes at an upcoming committee hearing? Do you want them to help you to get the bill to the floor? Just have something very specific that you're asking for. And then the 3rd and final thing is to remember to say thank you. And I mean that in a couple of ways. One is because legislators get asked for an awful lot of stuff, and they get fussed at for a lot of stuff that people aren't happy with, they do not get a lot of thank yous. They don't get a lot of appreciation. So even by saying thank you in the first place, you're helping to make yourself a little bit more memorable, helping to make that personal connection. And you can thank them for anything from their position on a past issue, all the way up into if it's somebody that you do not agree with, that you would never like that you are like kind of diametrically on the other side of any one given issue, then then just thank them for their service, because being a public legislator in office is not always the easiest job. So there's always something to thank them for. And then also the second part of that is to follow up with a thank you following the visit, and then that also gives you a second point of contact. All right, so some real quick things just to maximize your impact. One is, don't make assumptions. Just because somebody is Republican or Democrat doesn't mean they feel position X or position Y about your issue, but do learn about them as much as you can. Find any opportunity for connection or rapport, like just a highest level effectiveness. I know a group that, or a legislator and a social worker who connected over a mutual love of baseball. And after they made that connection during a legislative visit, they met every once in a while for coffee just to talk about baseball. So if you've got that sort of connection, then take advantage of it. Bring your personal stories of impact. Of course, doing so in a way that protects confidentiality. Say if something comes up and you don't know the answer to the question, just say, I don't know, protect your integrity. But that also is another chance for a second point of contact, because if you say something like, I don't know, but I'll get back with you with the answer, then suddenly you've got another opportunity to talk to them. Do be prepared for strategies of resistance, the same way that that we're prepared for strategies of resistance when we deal with our clients who may be resistant to doing things we don't want them to do. Legislators are not dissimilar in that means. They may tell you that a bill is going nowhere when really they just want to discourage you from pushing for it. They may ask you questions that like might be designed to discourage you. So just kind of be aware of the fact that can happen, and know that you're the expert and that you're bringing a lot of stuff to the table. And then also follow up after the meeting. All right, so I've got a few articles in the resource section that go into each of these issues a little bit more, but some of the ethical considerations or questions when we get to these, this is, well, one, yes, maintaining confidentiality when bringing in our stories. Two, the question of like, okay, well, if you're advocating for aging services, if you get what you're advocating for, does that mean children's services loses out? So that question of limited resources, or how the budget is configured and who wins, but also trying to avoid that thought where where it is pitting one group against another and saying that only one can be effective. Avoiding groupthink, or kind of just falling into that mentality where all you do is talk to people who agree with you, and so maybe you're not hearing the other perspective like we were talking about earlier. Starting where the client is versus cultural sensitivity. So, one of the things I've mentioned on dealing with legislators at other presentations is that, you can start where the legislator is. And like the same tools that we do with our clients, and that might help them, if you're at position 100 and they're at position 0, you're probably not going to flip them to all the way to 100, but you might manage to bring them over to 5 when they were at 0 previously. But then there's always that question of like, if you're starting where they are and you're talking about sensitive things, how do you do so in a way that's sensitive to, making sure that you're not starting where they are, but speaking in a way that's insensitive to other cultures. This last one, this next to the last one, this professionalism and respect when advocating. There's a whole other article on that, so if you want to learn more about that. But there's different philosophies of, one that says, well, we should always maintain professionalism and respect when advocating, and then the Saul Alinsky or other people's philosophies that says, but yes, but if it's more effective to to do things that might not be like peaceful and respectful, then is that what our ethical obligation is? So that's like one of those tensions as well. And I know we only have like 4 minutes, and I have a little bit more. So, and then just finally that question about applying to volunteer time. But there are articles that I posted in the resource section about some of these issues. So dynamics of change is the last section. And one is to say, okay, so if you ask 100 people for the opposite of success, 99 would say failure. But the opposite of success is not failure. It's the unwillingness to try again and learn from the past. Change, and especially legislative change, is a very, very slow process. And being successful in it means, one of the biggest things that it means is that you do not give up. The 3 top characteristics of successful advocates are all like very related to each other, and those are persistence, tenacity, and patience. And it's very easy to underestimate the impact that you're having as an individual. We see that all the time when we have our legislative education advocates. Like, well, I don't really know whether I made a difference or not. But then after that event, we see huge shifts in change, and we know that all of those people were making a difference. It's just all of those very small impacts put together as one. And it's far easier to do nothing than something. So it's the same way that it's easier to kill a bill versus pass a bill. You have to overcome you have to overcome the status of just doing nothing. You have to push past the tendency to just do nothing before you actually can get something accomplished. So in the last legislative session, there were 3,758 bills filed, and only 301 passed, which is 8%. The majority of bills that were filed don't even get a committee hearing, and the average for a bill to get passed is 4 years. All right, I know we're running really short on time, so I won't go into which happens in each year, but it can last far longer and be successful. This was just to illustrate for the example from Parks and Recreation, where that whole show, it took like 4 years to get like just something as simple as, we don't want this huge, giant, dangerous pit in our neighborhood. So we do push for a few things in ours, including Senate Bill 530, which would include diagnosis and scope of practice, and adding practice protection for social workers, which is really just protection, and one of only 5 states that doesn't have the diagnosis in our scope of practice. And this is another quote that sort of speaks to that same thing about the nature of incremental progress. So we've been working on that bill for like 8 to 10 years, and we're very, very close to the finish line. But that's another one of those very simple things. So I do have some resources, some articles to explore if you want to read a little bit more about the ethical considerations. This first one was the one that's about that respect issue. And I think it's 1 o'clock, so it's officially over, but I will stay on the line. So if anybody wants to hang out for questions, I will remain on the line as long as you like.
Great. Yeah, I'll just, first of all, thank you, Joanna, so much for all the cool information, and thanks everybody for joining us. I just want to say a few things before anybody jumps off. If you want to get your continuing education credit for this workshop, I posted a link to the survey in the chat section on the control panel. So just go ahead and click that link. It's a really quick survey. It'll take you just a minute or two. Once that's submitted, we're going to go ahead and send those over to our continuing education department to get you your certificate within a few days or so. So that's how you get that. Also, you mentioned you have some resources. You can find those under the handouts section in the control panel. In case you couldn't find it, it's entitled Handouts, and there's a PDF there with some information from Joanna about today's presentation. So yeah, with that, I know some people will have to leave, but since Joanna's sticking around for questions, I will name off a few of those here. Let's see what we got. Well, I guess a good one to go over real quick, if you have time, Joanna, is just the status of
Mm-hmm.
Senate Bill 530 and what people can do
Okay.
to help with that.
I would absolutely love to talk about that because it is something that we will need to have people advocate on very shortly. And I'll rewind a little bit. Senate Bill 530 has gone to. All right, I'm just going to answer it and forget about it because I can't manage to control the PowerPoint and talk at the same time. But we'll get there. All right. The entire Senate last year, and then so this year it crossed over to the House. It needs to get the vote from the House, and then it would go to the governor's desk, presuming it doesn't get amended or some other thing that would mean it would have to go back to the Senate. But we've had one big step with that happen not last week, but the week before when we passed the House Professional Licensing Committee, which was the major hurdle that we had to get through in the House. And then the one last thing that we need to do is to get a vote in the House floor. So we actually are going to be sending out some emails next week asking people to call, because next week is that real sweet spot right before the House goes back into session the following week. Where we can maybe get some momentum and try and get some energy, and the ask, like I said about wanting to know what your ask is. The ask is to push to get it to the House floor as quickly as possible. We have a real big shot here that we could get this bill passed in April. But we do have some time beyond that if it doesn't work, but we really want to get it passed in April, and it could even be passed before our upcoming Legislative Education and Advocacy Day on April 23rd.
Great, awesome. Another question we had here a little bit earlier was, what should I guess I'm kind of interpreting the question here, but should a social worker feel obligated to vote, to register to vote, and to actually do that? What if a social worker isn't registered to vote and doesn't plan to?
Yeah, that is that consideration that we were talking about. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be personal things that can come into play, like we said about like social workers respect person and environment. We also respect, that there are that it's a whole person thing, and that nothing is quite as simple as black and white. I would say in general, social workers should at the very least be educated on the elections, the impact of the elections, and that they should, at least try to vote on behalf of their elected officials. But if there are other factors that would mean that somebody really didn't feel comfortable doing that for whatever reason, that could be explored. And like we said at the beginning of this presentation, this is one of those pieces of the Code of Ethics that you're not likely going to be called up on violations for, on charges for violating. So, so it's one of those things you have to consider. It's one of those things you have to figure out, like, well, how am I going to interpret that section of the Code of Ethics and apply it to my own life? But it's definitely not something where I can be here and tell you that you absolutely have to vote to be an ethical social worker, because there may be other factors that are involved.
Gotcha. Another question we got was related to, can you give some...
Tyler, I can't hear you again.
Oh, my bad.
Okay.
How about now? You feel okay? So a question about, can you give some examples of strategies of resistance, like you mentioned with speaking with legislators?
Absolutely. The strategies of resistance, a lot of these are stories from our past advocacy days. I've had students or other, you might be feeling, especially if you're not an experienced advocate, you might be feeling kind of inexperienced or uneducated. You might feel like, oh, well, the legislator isn't automatically going to be an expert in the process and what's going on. So, you obviously, you're feeling like you have take their word for stuff. And I think that legislators sometimes take advantage of that. So they might, I've had folks where folks were told, why are you coming to me with this bill? This bill doesn't have a chance of passing this year, or something like that, and where people have come back to us with those kind of comments. And one, it happened in situations where the bill did pass later that year. So, no, they don't always know the answer. And two, what I would say in general, like any of these things, you just sort of have to take it like with that that same philosophy. I think it's like a martial arts philosophy of like kind of rolling with things and like pushing it back on them, of saying something like, answering any resistance that you get with just something along the lines of like, well, okay, I understand that, but we really want to at least get education out about it, or like help you to understand why this is important to us, but don't let it discourage you from continuing to get your message across.
Great. Yeah, I hate to jump back to SB 530, but there was a follow-up question on that as well. So can you kind of clarify, if passed, will SB 530 ban LSWs who are currently providing therapy from doing so?
No, it will not. It would encourage folks who, the only thing that the SB 530 does is specific to private practice. So it does not mean that if you're doing therapy like in an agency setting, then it wouldn't even impact you at all. If you are in an independent private practice doing psychotherapy as an LSW, then it would impact you. But it does not impact the vast majority of LSWs.
Okay. What about any comments on advocacy within an organization or like a treatment agency?
Within an agency, well, one of the things that I didn't go into, but I have in other presentations, because I talk about advocacy a lot, but this one was focused more on ethics, and others talk more about, specialize more in other things. But within an agency, and one of the reasons why sometimes social workers are discouraged from participating in advocacy is because they think, oh, I can't because I work for, I work for a 501c3, or I work for the state government. And there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about like what kind of add on to that is that there is nothing prohibiting you from advocating on your own time, no matter where you work. But even if you do work at an agency that needs to advocate on behalf of something, then there are like 20% of your there up to 20% during an H election year, and I think up to like 5% of your total nonprofit budget can be spent towards advocacy, and things like education don't count on that. So if you're just talking to a legislator about like, hey, I think suicide prevention is important, or I think more school social workers would help with some of the issues that we're facing in our schools. Saying stuff like that, but without saying, so I ask you to support, House bill, whatever, is not considered advocacy. So there's always all kinds of things you can do with education. If you're talking about making change within a agency or organization, then I would say the principles of advocacy can be applied. This workshop is focused on the government, but you can still apply it, and I would be willing to speak with whoever asked that question to explore that a little bit further if they want.
Great. Yes. Is your contact information then in the handout, Joanna? Is
it? I do not believe it is.
Okay.
But yeah. But we can make sure that we include it in the follow-up email messages.
Okay, great. Yeah, we will be emailing everybody in a little bit today with a link to the evaluation in case you didn't get that. And I will make sure to include Joanna's information there as well in case you're interested in reaching out to her. We did have a few people with specific questions about specific legislative issues, so probably a better conversation to have with you personally later.
Yep.
So
yep, I would say in the interest of getting off that I am happy to take anybody's individual questions via email, via phone call. Got a busy schedule at a lot of meetings where I'm out of the office, so if you want to speak via phone, it's better to make an appointment. So probably still use the email address and just use that to schedule a phone call.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. And again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I feel like we got a lot of awesome information today. And again, make sure you download the handout in the handout section there, and we will be following up with you shortly today. So have a great day, everybody.